You're listening to the 2019 Nelson Arts Festival, Page and Blackmore Pukapuka Talks. This thinking brunch session features Kerensa Johnston, Jess Berentson-Shaw, Ange Palmer and Raven Maeder in conversation with Kim Hill. Morena, welcome to Page and Blackmore Pukapuka Talks and our second thinking brunch for this year, The Time to Act. My name is Kerry Sunderland and I'm the coordinator of Pukapuka Talks, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here this morning for this very significant conversation. I think the recent Nelson City Council election result and the support for the school strikes here in Nelson both show how many of us here living in Nelson are really ready for change and believe it's time to act. But what does ACT mean? And that's what we're about to find out in this conversation this morning. So I would really like now to just introduce and welcome and thank Kim Hill very much for coming to chair today's session, and I'll hand over to her to introduce the rest of the panel. Please join me in a round of applause to welcome them.
Morena. Sorry about the World Cup. Move on now. There are greater things at stake, although, of course, Greta Thunberg sends her commiserations. No, you're right, I should have kept it in my pocket. You'll know the prognosis. The International Panel on Climate Change reports... Oh, God. No, okay. The International Panel on Climate Change reports that our best chance of avoiding catastrophe is keeping temperature increase below 1.5 degrees. To do that, we need to cut global emissions by half in the next 10 years and achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It's like blah, 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 right? The IPCC says what's needed is a rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented change in all aspects of society. That's code for a revolution, right? And I know it was a late night, but in the words of Steve Hansen, we can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old. It was half-time talk, it didn't work, right? But there's got to be a way, and we can't just give up. Well, we could. Actually, we could give up. There are those who argue, Jonathan Franzen argues, it's too late now. We need to start adjusting instead of squandering our energy on turning the Titanic. I'll run that past the panel, see how we get on. Let me introduce them. Kerensa Johnston is the Chief Executive of Wakatū Incorporation. She's a lawyer. She's worked in the private and the public and the academic areas. And her role, as she describes it, is to think about the long-term implications of what the incorporation does. Dr. Jess Berentson-Shaw is a science communicator. She has a PhD in health psychology. She's co-director of the not-for-profit policy organisation, The Workshop. She's research associate at the University of Auckland's Public Policy Institute. She's written a booklet, BWB series, called A Matter of Fact, Talking Truth in a Post-Truth World, in which she explains why more information doesn't necessarily change people's minds. Raven Maeder is studying law and environmental studies at Victoria University. She's a national coordinator of School Strike for Climate in Aotearoa, and also the current chair of the UNESCO Aotearoa Youth Leaders, correct? And Ange Palmer she's taking a year out, interestingly enough, and we'll talk about that, medical herbalist and a documentary maker. She co-produced 2 Degrees, which is a convincing argument, and we'll discuss it, that the failure of the UN climate change negotiations in Copenhagen 10 years ago not to mention the 3 climate change conferences since then, prove that governments can't be left in charge of doing anything. And furthermore, climate justice requires a huge redistribution of resources from rich countries to poor countries. Ange is studying leadership for change right now. Please welcome the panel. What we found ourselves talking about quite avidly as we were inhaling coffee before this was a sense of urgency. How do we feel the requisite sense of urgency without feeling like, yes, it's too late to do anything, or the thing's too big? And I want to talk to you, Jess, because it's a tricky thing to convey a sense of urgency without making people recoil and say, whatever, chill out. What do you think?
Yeah, I think our natural inclination, I talk about this quite a lot, is that we just want to go at it from the front door. We just want to hammer on people's front door and say, look, just do something. Here's all the information. We've got to act. And while that feels good inside, there's kind of an emotional response to that. That tends to work with people, and I'm making an assumption here that most people in this room have probably already persuaded that we've got to act. But it doesn't work particularly well for people who aren't in that space, who think that we need to act yet. And so in order to encompass a sense of urgency in which you motivate people, you have to come at it through a side door. And you've got to be more strategic about the way that you communicate and frame that this is a problem that is urgent and needs acting on. And what we were talking about a little bit actually was here in Nelson of some of the local impacts that people are starting to feel in terms of water resource. And increasingly what we're seeing is that people are both looking for and seeing those local impacts. So that's one way to frame urgency for people, is to make it real for them in terms of their local environment. And then there's the sense of connection to, it's happening to me. But the other way to frame a sense of urgency is to think about what are these side doors into people's ways of thinking and seeing about something that they might want to immediately just put up a barrier to, because you've come straight at them with a really kind of, it's freaking them out or whatever.
A sense of urgency is all very well, but what does one do with it? What does one do? Have you got any thoughts on that, Ange? You're taking a year out to figure this through, right? How is it going so far?
Kia ora koutou. Well, I'm here on behalf of my daughter and my grandson, Zen, and sea turtles and dragonflies, because I am them and they are me. And so when we face this, for me, it's that I am this earth. This earth is me. And therefore, when I can step into that place in my heart and get out of my head that this is a problem that needs to be solved, I open myself up into a whole lot of different information that can come through.
How's that going to help the revolution, Ange? I mean, what people have to be persuaded about is that we all have to give something up. We all have to become poorer. Is that what you're telling your incorporation members? I doubt it.
No. No. So, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is it's never too late. As long as we're alive and we're breathing and we've got thinking brains, it's never too late. And we've been through so many iterations in terms of our evolution over time. We should have confidence in our ability to meet this challenge. So we're certainly not telling people that we're going to be worse off as a result of the changes that we need to make. So what we're seeing in terms of Wakatū and who we represent, so it's 4,000 families across our region, across Te Tauihu. We're seeing it as a real opportunity, actually, just to relearn a whole lot of stuff that we've lost. All the things that our grandparents used to do and with respect to how we related to the land, the practices that we had, how we looked after food. We didn't waste anything. I was listening yesterday to your
Deborah Manning,
who was talking about food waste. We already know all of this, so it's a matter of relearning those practices and those values that we've really only lost in the last 50 years.
But you're part of the capitalist system now. And there are those who say that it is completely inconsistent. We cannot have the capitalist system, which is based on consumption, and save the planet at the same time. Where are you on the revolution spectrum?
Well, I just think maybe the first thing I'd like to touch on is just this idea of, asking people to give up something, or that, to act on climate changes, to make this massive sacrifice and lose something. And
it's a downer,
yeah,
right?
But I would just ask us to think of the cost of inaction, and to think, the fact that actually we are facing this grave challenge that literally is putting life on Earth at risk, at stake, and we know the science is clear on that. If we don't act, life on Earth will not continue as we know it. So the cost of inaction is so much greater than the cost of action. And I think actually also I would really agree with, reframing this issue as actually an opportunity for us to create the more beautiful, more just, more sustainable world that we know is possible. And I think that automatically changes the way that we address the issue, not from a place of fear or having to give up something for future generations to have a viable planet to live on, but actually for us now in this moment in history where we're at this crossroads, for us to forge the path for that better future that we know is actually possible. Yeah.
I don't want to rain on your parade. But there is a view, and I'm quoting Nathaniel Rich here, whose article on climate change occupied the entire New York Times Magazine last August 2018. And he said, human beings are incapable of, and you might like to talk about this as well, human beings are incapable of sacrificing present convenience to forestall a penalty imposed on future generations.
White man bullshit.
Yeah, I don't think...
White man bullshit. Did you hear that?
Well, I think, I'd agree with Jess about that. And I'd also say that's a very individualistic view of the world, which I don't understand. I don't even understand really what that means, because so much of the work that the people here are doing is about our future generations. So you can't do that work with that sort of understanding. Most of the work I do on a daily basis, the benefit will not be seen in my generation. It will be seen, 100 or 200 years' time. So I think that's right, Jess. I think that's a particular view of the world. I would question whether, I hope, most of the people in the room would share such an individualistic approach to how we do things.
We are, and I think it's fairly safe to say, preaching to the converted here, however. It's all those barbarians outside the gate that really we need to deal with, right? We can't have our little bubble of self-righteous sanctimoniousness. And this is Jess's argument. How do you address people who may share Nathaniel Rich's view?
And that's the interesting thing about that is that there is the things that hold a system in place are a narrative that this all that we have is all that is possible. And the way that we talk about it and the language we use and the people who get to talk and the people who have the power in that hold that system in place. But it's a system built by people. And while there's that system that's been built by some people, there are multiple other systems that have been built by other people that reflect a different set of values. And why I get to values is because what we know is that actually, in reality, most people value a collective well-being. And when you think about it, how on earth did we survive as human beings if we didn't value the collective over ourselves? But at the moment, we exist within a specific system in which individualism and individual well-being is prioritised over the collective. But it's just a system. And the things that hold that system in place are people. So if you can change the lens that is primarily dominating about the things that matter and what most people value, then you can start to change the system. So why I talk about values is because what we see in the research is that if you can engage those values that we know matter to most people, and that's collectivism, then you can start to change those systems.
You have to choose a different word, though, because you all know the view is, that climate change, and it's specifically been said, Naomi Klein addresses this in her latest book on fire, that climate change is some kind of Trojan horse through which eco-socialists can overthrow capitalism. Now, you may not object to that project, but it's not going to win the hearts and minds of everybody else, is it? What do you think about that?
Language is really important.
Language is important.
It's hugely important. And, you know, what I was saying earlier about banging on people's front doors and demanding to be let in, it's not a strategic way of doing it. And, you know, I was saying to somebody the other day is that it's not about being the smartest person in the room, it's about being disciplined. And what we have possibly lacked in this space is a discipline to understand that you have to go through those side doors, that being smart and telling people that they have to act on climate change is not how human beings work. It's through your values and it's through language and narrative that you can actually start to open those side doors to allow those people to see.
All right, can you give me an example of a side door?
So we did some research recently which talked about, and this is something that I think happens in the School for Climate Change space, is that responsibility is a value, and there's lots of different ways that different cultures see or talk about responsibility, is a value that really engages people. So if you think about farmers, for example, dairy farmers in New Zealand, they have a great sense of responsibility to the land and to further generations. And although the narrative might be that they don't care, actually what we know is that they do. And if you can start talking to them about their responsibility and guardianship of the land over the long term, you start to have productive conversations with them. If you bang on their door and tell them that they've ruined our country and for their own good, that immediately shuts them down. So there are these values which you know that people share, which are really productive for having good conversations about climate change and then talking about the evidence and what needs to be done. So, for example, in what you're seeing in Stuff. So Stuff, for example, and Patrick Cruson has changed some of the editorial stance of reporting on climate change. And what I've seen is they've started to talk about farmers who really have started to make big changes to their practices, that they care about the environment. And those are the kind of narratives that have to shift in order for us to have more productive kind of conversations.
As opposed to making people feel bad and retire to their corners. So tell me how this 500-year plan is going to work.
Well, I will answer that question, but just picking up on your question to Jess and what Jess has just said. I mean, I think you're touching on the idea of climate change, and all that we're seeing now is really just a symptom of a broader problem, the structural capitalist economy that we're working within, and I think that. Raven's been thinking about that a lot. That question is one that as a community, as a region, we have to really grapple with, because the impetus for change will come from us, not from a government that's tied into its 3-year cycle. So the 500-year plan, our families about 10 years ago developed a 500-year intergenerational plan.
Te Pai
Tawhiti, which means the distant horizon. So the idea being you see a mountain, you walk towards that, you get to the top of that mountain. Of course, there's just more mountains to conquer after that. So it's a very long-term view. Then. We just keep going. So it's a tool that we developed, and we were really deliberate. We wanted our community to develop that, not consultants.
So I get the rhetoric, but in actual practice, what does it mean?
In actual practice, what it means is it's been a really difficult 10 years trying to work out how we make that bite for every single business decision or organisational decision that we make on a daily basis. And that's been incredibly hard. And I would say we're even though it's 10 years old, the plan, we're right at the beginning of figuring out how our orchard manager, for example, implements a 500-year plan. Yeah. Because it can't just be a plan a mission statement on the shelf that doesn't mean anything to anybody, which is often what happens with organisations.
That's right. So on a daily basis, how is it addressed? Because when we talk about action, this is what we need to know. You know, we know that in a certain segment of the community, the heart is willing. What can you do? What do you do? What do you tell the orchard manager?
Well, obviously it depends on what you have the power to control. So in our case, I think we're incredibly fortunate. After the Crown, we're the second biggest landowner in this region. So we actually have the ability to make real change. Now, one of the issues we're grappling with at the moment, all of our farming is conventional. So we're orchardists, horticulturalists. Now, I have to be a bit careful in terms of my view versus the view of our families and our governors, but my view is that's not sustainable. We need to transition to regenerative practices. We need to do that as quickly as we can without going bankrupt.
You mean what you're producing is okay, but the way you're producing it is not? Is that what you're saying?
I think there are problems with both.
All
I think
right.
the way we're producing, and I think the what we're producing in terms of the product, where it goes, and so on, is problematic in the long term. And that is facing all of us in the horticulture industry, I would say, who are exporting around the world.
Mm-hmm. And your 4,000 shareholders, they all will have different opinions. I mean, I'm seeing the Wakatū Incorporation as a kind of a microcosm of the world, right? How do you employ the measures that Jess might suggest to get people on board?
Well, the first communication, I think, is the first. You have to have really good communication.
And listening, Jess would say, right?
Listening to what people value. I would say our families as a whole, those 4,000 families, are probably ahead of us in terms of their thinking about what's required. And perhaps our community is also ahead in terms of, you know, where we're thinking compared to where the decision makers are at. So it's communication, but it's also trying to find those shared values and then using those as the springboard for action.
I just wanted to pick up on something about that governments won't act. And I think that that's part of quite a strong narrative that we have that comes from this kind of an individualistic model which we operate under, which is that we can all act as consumers, but we don't know how to act as citizens. And this is something Anne Pettiford, the economist, talks about a bit, is that we're constantly engaged as consumers, so we think about what's our consumer action that we can do. We're really quite rarely engaged as citizens.
That's very interesting, actually, isn't it? Because whenever one thinks about what one can do, it's like, well, I won't buy that, or I won't eat that.
Yeah. And at the moment, the system makes hypocrites of us all, and it makes it incredibly hard to do that. Like, I think about how I got here. I flew in a plane, I drove in a car, we've driven today. You know, I ride my bike in Wellington, but I do it despite the fact that there's bugger all infrastructure for that, and I'm in a reasonable fear of my life most days. But we can't keep asking people to do the hard thing if we don't make the default the kind of either the climate positive thing. So I do think that engaging, and that's what School for Climate tries to do, they're engaging themselves as citizens, and they're saying to government, no, actually, you need to create normative policy. So policy built around the well-being of people, not around how we currently operate, which is a carbon-based economy driven by cars, based on individual GDP, you know. And the government is trying to do things. I think about the well-being budget. Okay, it's not perfect. It's a little bit like, what the hell is this thing? But it's an attempt to say there are things that are more meaningful from a government's perspective to measure than just how much growth is happening.
Are you confident there's a change in that? Because I still hear the GDP figures recited as if it's good news or bad news, good news or bad news. Growth. We've got to have economic growth.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, if I could just sort of carry on from this sort of
sorry,
thread of discussion, but no, it's totally fine. I fully agree that, you know, for too long, the whole narrative has been about individual change and that, you know, individually we're responsible for climate change and kind of this internalized guilt, and that the change needs to come from people stopping using plastic straws or not eating meat. And obviously, you know, we all do, especially in developed countries, have a responsibility to lower our own carbon footprint. But I think that just perpetuates the same system that has got us into this issue. And actually, what is needed is deep systemic change, and that is not going to come from individual action, all, you know, separated. It's going to come from collective action to really push big corporations and governments to change, because we know that, you know, 100 companies are responsible for climate change, and it's not individual people that need to bear the full consequence of transition. It's these big corporations that literally profit off destroying the planet. So I think that once we reframe that conversation, we realise that we actually all have a lot more in common than we think on this issue. Like, we're all going to be affected by climate change. Farmers will be affected by climate change. You know, everyone, all sectors of society will be affected, and it is in all of our common interest to hold these big institutions to account and to really tell them that we're not going to tolerate it anymore, and we are demanding immediate action now to transition to this future where we actually can live in a way more just society. And so, yeah, I think that sort of is really important in terms of like how we communicate, and it's definitely what School Strike for Climate has been focusing on. Not, you know, us all there. I think everyone's kind of at different levels of the journey of seeing that as the main issue, but that's definitely what internationally young people are calling for, is the systems that we have inherited are failing us, and that they are failing us, and that's what we're calling out.
And by systems we've inherited, you mean consumerism and capitalism?
Not just those, but all of these interconnected issues, you know.
But those are the big ones,
yes,
right?
They are.
And
financial systems, educational systems, the medical system, all of the systems in our society at the moment are essentially not meeting our needs and, you know, becoming more and more dysfunctional.
How did that happen, do you think, Ange?
Through the story of separation, that we have not had a sense that we're connected to each other and not connected to the earth. And that story of separation has just propelled all of the structures of Western society, and we're reaching those limits. And I feel strongly that I totally agree with what Raven's saying, but I really question whether trying to hold governments and corporations to account is going to bring change quickly enough. And I have a real concern that we have the potential of a much more imminent climate collapse, because we're not only in a climate crisis, we have a biodiversity climate crisis. We've got 90% of insects in some areas that are lost. I'm a partner in 100 acres of native bush up the Polarised Valley, and when I was up there a couple of months ago, I looked over the canopy of our forest, and I would say between 10 and perhaps 20% of the canopy trees in the forest have died, and a lot of the saplings in the understory have died. They're brown. This is our forest right up behind us right here. And I don't know if any of you in the audience had the same slight unease that I had yesterday in my body, a cellular unease when we had such a hot, windy day yesterday. I see nodding heads. So we have a memory of what happened here last summer. We didn't just have a hot summer, we had a drought. And we can feel in our cells that our very existence is on a very thin thread. And so I'm thinking, so what do we need to do locally to be prepared should, in the next few years, who knows, we don't know, things should start falling over very quickly. And I think, what if there was a scientist who said to us, or an astronomer, there's an asteroid coming towards us. It's not likely to hit us. It might hit us in 100 years or so. It could hit us in 50 years. There's a slight possibility it could hit us in the next 3 to 5 years. It probably won't. Would we not then say, jeepers, shouldn't we actually get a little bit ready just in case? If we act as if it matters and it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. But if we act as if it doesn't matter and it does matter, then it matters. And so for me, I feel like as a community, can we wait for our council? Can we wait for local government New Zealand to get on with its localisation campaign? Or do we need to actually start organising in streets, in neighbourhoods, and saying, can we share cars? Can we share gardens? Who needs help in our neighbourhood? Who needs nursing care? Who's got fruit that they can share? Can we actually sustain ourselves in this region? Can we feed ourselves with food? And I really think that's the conversation we need to be having. And through that conversation, our social bonds will start to be rebuilt. Our connections will be rebuilt. And it's an extremely exciting time.
I mean, that would be a good thing to do whether we had climate change or not, right?
Absolutely.
That's the big argument. There are many, many things that we can do. And we don't even have to think about climate change. They would all be good things. Having said all that, Ange, I live in Wellington, all right? I know the big one's going to arrive any day now.
That's right.
Do I move? You know, I mean, when did I last look at the use-by date of the baked beans in my kit? It's like the danger is we become accustomed to that sense of emergency and it ceases to be an emergency.
We have become numb to the trauma because we've had such high exposure to trauma in our lives, in our society. We watch it on movies. We've been watching it on movies for years. We see it in the news. It's so big and so much that we've actually become immune to be able to respond. And so what I feel that we need to do is go deeply into our trauma, into our heartbreak, into our grief, into our disbelief.
I don't think we've got time for all that.
We have to.
I seriously don't.
Because that is the route. That is the portal. It's the route to go through that deep emotional, psychological process in ourselves that will then bring us out into a point of taking that urgent action. But if we don't address this deep inner held stuff that's sitting there, we can't move forward. That's my view.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are already very much in the depths of that journey. I think that's kind of why finally the world is ready for these massive climate movements. I mean, people have been saying this stuff for years. Like when I lived in Nelson as a 14-year-old, you know, I would also attend always rallies and protests, and I probably saw many of your faces there as well, but there was nowhere near that kind of mobilisation and energy for urgent change, and now we're finally seeing that, and I think that's because collectively we are going through this realisation of the situation that we're in, and we're navigating that grief together. And I actually would like to just agree with what you were saying about community building, and I think you know, that's something we need to do regardless of climate change or not, but it's one of the main ways that we can be resilient in the face of climate breakdown is by building community locally and looking out for each other. And it's actually probably a way we can mitigate climate change as well, because we know that that will be a more sustainable model in which we can live. But yeah, I find that really interesting. I think also that is going to be a really key way for us to navigate that grief together, is to come together, because when you are feeling that grief alone, it's incredibly overwhelming and it freezes you up and makes you feel like, you know, there's no way that you're ever going to be able to create change in the time that is necessary. And I think that's why a lot of young people have found getting involved in things like School Strike for Climate and other, you know, we've got kids that are planting trees and doing beach cleanups, and it's about finding that collective strength and actually a place to put that fear. And that's what a lot of the young people have been telling me, is finally they feel like they have other people around them who feel the same way, and together we can move forward. So,
and you know, like,
talk with that.
I think that's really important. We were talking about this before, is that it's difficult for people to visualise an alternative system that they exist in. We have a particular bias towards seeing what we have right now. And I am really aware that what we're doing is framing this from a very particular cultural perspective. I would say that for Indigenous cultures and for people who have been experiencing climate change and colonisation and the inequitable distribution of power for hundreds of years, these are conversations and work that they've been going on for years. So this is a particularly kind of mainstream. It's just coming into the mainstream for now. So I think that there's existing knowledge and existing action that has already been happening for years on the side that actually needs to be lifted up a little bit more and having wider conversations about power dynamics and power distribution. We have the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand. If we honoured it appropriately, which basically means a redistribution of power, then we would see a lot of those things come to the fore in which different decisions and different power brokers were in action. So I think there's an opportunity here. But just getting back to, unless we can visualise an alternative future, it's very hard to work towards that and those alternative systems. And I think what is going on is actually there are lots of organisations who have been doing that and are already doing that. And, I had a conversation with Jade Kake, who's just written a new book called Rebuilding the Kāinga, which is about, she gives examples of different hapu and iwi who are rebuilding on their whenua, having to overcome massive bureaucracy in order to do so. But the point that she makes in that is that there are alternative economic models that have existed alongside, Eurocentric Western economic models that have always been there and that offer us solutions in this space around, growing our own food locally or thinking about the redistribution of how food systems work. So I don't think it's this, we have to come up with these brand new amazing solutions. They're there, we just need to make them more obvious and clearer and give them more space in terms of the narrative.
What do we do about Bangladesh? I mean, this comes back to climate justice, right? There's Bangladesh, who's got a carbon footprint of nothing, and we are saying, right, well, we have to all start living better now.
Yeah.
We can't just focus on our community. We can't just focus on our personal grief.
Well, I've got a lovely strategy for that, and some of the study that I've been doing this year is with a guy called Charles Eisenstein, who's written a book called Climate: A New Story. And I'm actually doing a little online course with him at the moment called Unlearning to Save the World. But he gives a lovely analogy, and he wrote it recently when the Amazon fires were burning, and I just want to remind you that at the same time fires were burning across Africa as well. But he says that, how do we, when we think about these things, so for instance, when we think about the people in Bangladesh, how do we deal with that? And he says, well, if for instance, the people in Bangladesh are drowning and they're looking at you and you're looking at them and they are saying to you, what did you do? What were you doing while I was drowning? If you can look at them and say, I was planting trees out at Wakatū. I was running a local food bank. I was sitting with my friend who was dying. I was mothering my child in the best way that I possibly could. Then that person will look at you and, acknowledge that you were doing all that you could do from your place in your world to make the difference. Because we're all connected. It's a morphic field. So everything that we do to make a difference makes a difference in the bigger picture.
Giving the money would help. Yeah. Like a lot of money.
Giving them money would help. I mean, essentially, I completely get what you're saying, Ange, but we're talking about massive redistribution of resources. Climate justice is what's required. Honestly, if I was drowning in Bangladesh, I couldn't give a shit how you're raising your child.
But I suppose the point I'm making is how do we as individuals hold this knowledge and this process? So one of the key way that the film that we made started was that we were making the film about something called RED, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. This is an economic framework under the United Nations climate change framework, which essentially transfers large amounts of money to developing countries who are going to cut down their forests to make money, which they absolutely are entitled to, and it's about transferring money to them to keep their forests standing, because we acknowledge that we really need that. So there are these systems happening in place, and there's all sorts of economic instruments and social instruments out there on various scales that are happening, but how do we in this room, how do we help those people in Bangladesh?
I just want to say something about that. I appreciate we can't say no, you must stop chopping those trees down, because we've chopped all ours down and we're in a big mess. But you can't chop yours down for your wee cow and your what. So we'll give you money not to chop the trees down. We're not talking about well-meaning subsistence farmers. We're talking about massive deforestation corporations who will pocket the money, say thanks very much, and carry right on. The world is full of corporate criminals. And we cannot surely, Ange, assume that everybody is going to go deep into themselves and come up with some kind of altruistic purpose.
Well, I think if we frame it as this corporate criminals and there's us, we're setting up an us and them paradigm which feeds into that story of separation, which I don't think is particularly helpful. And I do feel that when we get a decent price on carbon, for instance, there are things that will help to change that. If we brought into legislation a law of ecocide, which is the work of Polly Higgins, which is in the process as well, so there was actually more legal levers, then that would help as well. But the reality is it's extremely complex, and I just don't know that stuff's going to happen quickly enough. And I think when we talked about do we actually have to give up anything? Absolutely, we have to give up. We have to give up a lot of things. Relinquishment is a whole part of our pathway forward, and I don't think that we should shy away from talking about that.
Yeah, though I think that if we're going to, that's a frame that we've used that haven't motivated people.
No, that's right.
Is that giving up stuff as a frame is demotivating for most people who are not in this space. If I think about that group, so we think about, what we would call our base, which is people who are already in that space and who want to act and are acting on climate change. Then there's the opposition, and those people are just never going to come on this space. They're deeply embedded in the systems which are protecting them. And then there's everybody else. And, one of the things we talk about is people move hugely between their beliefs. People are contradictory, they hold multiple values and multiple beliefs, and they sway wildly between them, because most people don't really feel that strongly about this stuff, believe it or not. And so if we come at them with a sense of everything that they have to give up, we're not finding the stuff that we have in common in order to move them forward into a space where they want to act.
Unless they're Catholics, in which case, job done.
Absolutely, and it's not that reality is not there, but. And people have to be able to see that there's a greater benefit to themselves, to the things that they value from a collective point of view, is that actually these systems leave us all in a much better off place from a collective place.
So we can frame it as climate heaven rather than climate hell,
Let me ask you, Kerensa, if we look at Wakatū Incorporation, and you've got your 4,000 families. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine that what you're doing could become larger? Like if we do admire and endorse your 500-year plan, and we admire and endorse your zero waste aspiration, you've got vaguely like-minded individuals. Can you imagine that we could extend it to New Zealand, or extend it to the Pacific, or extend it, is it a model?
Yeah.
A scalable model?
Well, I think Jess touched on it before. She's talking about a bigger conversation in terms of our constitutional arrangements. What does it mean what does the treaty mean in our country? Actually, what does it mean to be a New Zealander? Right, so that conversation, what does it mean to be an Indigenous New Zealander? And I'm kind of using that word, you've got to be careful using that word Indigenous in that context, but who are we as people? And I feel like we're on the cusp of a really positive, genuine discussion and understanding about what that actually means.
What gives you that feeling?
We've been the last 12 months or so, we've been engaged in it's our Te Tau Ihu intergenerational strategy, so that's work across the whole community. And we've been trying to create places where people can just come, talk about all sorts of things, resilience, ambition, innovation, and what does it mean for our region. And so what we're hearing from the people who have been participating in those conversations, and they're open to everybody. So local government, our iwi entities, businesses, community, is that we do have this shared set of values. So what does it mean to be a good kaitiaki of this place? Do we have a shared understanding of that? What does it mean to have a deep love of our land and to be a New Zealander? What are all the attributes that are involved with that?
I mean, the fact that everybody knows what kaitiaki means now, even at the most superficial level, that seems to me to be a massive change in New Zealand, right? I mean, you might not realise this because you've always known what kaitiaki is. But for the average Pākehā New Zealander, I don't think that's the case. And I think that's really filtering down. Whether it's going to translate into action as opposed to feel good is the question, right?
Yeah. I'd just like to say on the Te Tau Ihu intergenerational strategy, I think it's one of the most profound and exciting things that, or if not the most profound and exciting thing I've seen to date in the country, in our region, in terms of some leadership and visioning to the future.
No pressure.
No pressure. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were going to say?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say one of the really interesting things that's come out of those conversations is this real, particularly from our rangatahi, from the young person people's forums that have been operating, is a real concern in terms of stratification in our community, particularly with older people being to use their words, it's kind of shunted away from society into retirement homes, and this disconnect between the generations. So what we've been hearing from the young people is that they don't want, they want these communities where we're all together, where we're sharing our experience and our wisdom, where we're not separated from one another. And that then leads into, how do we design our landscape, our development, so that is actually enabled, as opposed to what we're seeing now, which is, quite separate, houses and developments being built. And we're part of that work because that's what we also, that's what we do.
Let me quote you something else that I suspect is also going to be called white man bullshit, but it seems my role in life is to represent the white man here on this panel. Here's one New Zealand commentator talking about Greta Thunberg and the school strike for climate. You might have read this, you might have ripped it up and thrown it away. There are good reasons for not taking 16-year-olds seriously when it comes to public policy. The real issue is how the world deals with climate change while at the same time maintaining and improving living standards. Who will carry the cost of fundamental change? All right? Okay, expression says it all. Jess, that's the person that you have to talk to.
No, it's not. That person will never believe anything that we have to say. And I would say, whose living standards? Yeah. Whose living standards are we trying to improve? That person, I can guarantee, has a pretty fantastic living standards. In fact, way beyond what is necessary in order for them to function. In fact, they've probably dipped way over the curb into being absolutely miserable now, which I would say that indicates. We don't need to spend our time amplifying those people. That's our mistake, is that those people represent a small group in our population. We don't need to spend our time listening to them, amplifying, sharing, responding. Ignore them. We need to be talking to
Sadly, you're not in the media. You know, there's a cartoon in our cafeteria, and how does it go? On the one hand, there's somebody saying, yes, we're going to talk to the well-informed scientific individual who knows all about this subject. And just for balance, we're going to talk to this idiot over here.
But
you know?
but you have a choice, right?
Yeah, that's a responsibility on the media. Yeah, but like, it's true.
I mean, think about what Stuff has done. Stuff is trying to, you know, that false balance stuff. I think most media know now that false balance stuff is out. And I would also say that actually some of the onus is on those of us who speak in the media as well to be much more disciplined about the type of narrative and discourse that we use.
But
as well.
we do not want, whether it be social media or mainstream media, to become a club talking to ourselves. That's the point. You can't say they disagree with us, therefore they're idiots. They may be idiots, but these idiots, they're going to have children and they're going to have...
But you don't say that, though. What I'm saying is that you don't actually engage in that very far opposition. What you engage in...
You leave them seething in their little large, medium-sized, however.
Yeah, we talk about don't negate, replace. Tell the story that you want to tell about climate change to those people who you know are listening and are sitting on the fence and could be pulled either way by this person. Sure, by all means, let's be clear on whether that is true or untrue. But there are, and we can be empathetic towards those people and their intense fear about losing power, which is what it's about. But there's also a huge group of people sitting in the middle who want to be spoken to. Why are we not speaking to them? Why are we speaking to this one guy?
But I think, Jess, the problem is when the idiots are the ones in power.
Yeah.
Right? So you come...
There is that.
There's that. So I think,
But that comes back to power redistribution, right?
Back, but I also think the role of the citizen and the role of the consumer. So how do we as citizens, or if we're in fact in positions of power, how do we use our influence to affect the idiots, essentially? Because there are a lot of idiots in power who have a great deal of influence and say over what happens.
Do we do that through the democratic process? I mean, I know, Raven, you were talking about how many young people have got onto the councils in this last wave of elections. That's great. Is that the way we're going to do it? Have we got time to do it that way?
I mean, I think that engaging in politics, we need to move beyond thinking that that's something that just happens every 3 years in elections, but actually it's something that happens every single day. And as citizens, we don't just, challenge power or ask for change in elections, but every single day through our mobilisation together and engagement in all of the very various ways in which we can engage with those institutions. So I do think that we do need to see massive diversification of the people that are sitting at the decision-making tables, and we're only going to see the change that we really need when all voices are represented around the table and we actually build the table together as well. So I do think that is one way, but we can't just wait for every 3 years to change the council a little bit. We have to demand radical change now and keep holding the people that have been elected to account. And so I think it's a really great thing that more young people have been elected. I think there's still many areas of New Zealand that need to have greater representation at the council beyond just young people. But it's a great start, and hopefully it will kind of translate into some more future-sightedness at the council decision-making table, and hopefully in the general elections too. So
here's what I'm interested in, and it kind of goes back to what we started off with, this idea of the sense of urgency. What do we do with it in a positive way rather than a negative hiding under the duvet way? Let me quote Naomi Klein, whose latest book is called On Fire, and she says, "To solve this crisis, it's going to take an all-out war on pollution and poverty and racism and colonialism, all at the same time. The individual can do nothing. A massive and organised global movement is required." Now, is that going to rally us, Or is that going to make us give up now? If the individual can do nothing, how do we mobilise?
How can the individual, not, if you're wanting a mass movement, how can an individual doing nothing, how can that movement form?
It's made up of individuals, but we have to act together, I think, is the difference. Rather than acting on our own in separation from everyone else, we need to recognise that actually it's going to take all of us together, and that everyone has something really important to give and also to learn. And I think, this movement, we are seeing I wouldn't say the birth, because I think it has been championed by many people for a really long time, and this is actually just kind of an awakening of the sort of middle class, like Western Pākehā people, in terms of like, okay, yeah, now we also care about the earth. But I think that we are seeing this mass mobilisation, and I would really agree that in order for this mobilisation to be sustainable, we are going to need everyone, and we are going to need to break down the barriers between these different generations. And so for young people, that means not being all like, oh, all the old people have failed us, but actually, what can we learn from you? What can we learn from our older generations, and how can they teach us things on the journey that we are going on together? And for older generations, that means listening to the young people. What kind of world do they want to inherit, and what can I do to make sure that I'm standing alongside them and building that world? So I think that mass mobilisation is made up of individuals, but we cannot act in isolation.
I don't like Naomi's analogy of war. I don't think the thing that we have to battle against something and rage against the machine. We actually need to work for something, not against something. And I think that on an individual level, we all have important decisions to make. Do we, buy another house? Do we pay off our mortgage? Do we save for retirement? Or do we start to shift where we put our individual finance? Do we quit our job, or do we cut down to 3 days a week to do some other sort of work in the community? Do we travel? Do we take holidays? There's actually a whole lot of individual decisions that we do need to make to assist this transition.
I mean, I would say that change happens very quickly, but we forget that. And I think about examples of that. The Berlin Wall, for example, end of apartheid in South Africa, the civil rights movement. Now, there was a huge amount of background work that went on for years behind those things, but they happened like that. At the tipping point that it happened, people just leapt at it and it happened. And we sometimes forget that change can happen very quickly once you get the right people behind an existing movement. And so for me, obviously, look, I work in public policy, so I have a deep belief in the power of good public policy. And I've seen where public policy makers can make a massive change, for example, just suddenly deciding that they're going to create an urban infrastructure which prioritises active transport. Has happened in a number of cities around the world in very short periods of time. So these things absolutely can happen at that structural level. And I think we have to see, we're really used to seeing things at an individual level. Our brains are primed to see things at the individual level and the concrete and the behaviours in front of us. Part of my job, I see, is lifting people to see the systems which are in operation and to think about how structures can be changed in order to make all of these individual actions the default, so that it's not this massive effort for me to get on my bike every day, or somebody who's not on their bike, but it's actually just the default, that getting in my car is not the default anymore, that getting on my bike with my kids is the default. So I still think that we have to think about what are the systems and structures and who are the power holders and where are the levers in that system. And that's where iwi organisations, it's really interesting, because I think we have a narrative which says that iwi organisations aren't powerful, and they actually are. Because, what you were saying about being the second largest landholder after the Crown, there's a lot of iwi and hapu-based organisations just doing their shit. They're just getting on with it and doing it, right? And that's happening all around New Zealand, and we can amplify that and talk about it.
I'm also interested in the idea of time, right? You've got your 500-year plan. We should be so lucky to have any 500 years, but that plan requires you to do stuff now. So we can be now future-proofing ourselves. It's just to get into that mindset, right? We need to give up eating meat.
That looks hard for you, Kim. Is it?
No, it's not hard for me. It was hard for a guy at the breakfast table this morning. But no, I think that's true. I mean, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the livestock's long shadow, 50% of greenhouse gas emissions is attributable to animal husbandry.
Yeah, I 100% think that the systems that we have around agriculture in this country are unsustainable and need to be tackled immediately.
There goes the economy.
But I want to say that the way that we frame the issue determines the solutions that we come up with. So if we think about the system that we have as being the only system that could ever possibly exist, then of course we're going to say we need to stop eating meat. But people have eaten meat in sustainable ways for hundreds and thousands of years. So it's the systems that need to change.
There are 6 billion of us now. I mean, I don't think that it's conceivable.
I don't eat meat, but I just think that, we shouldn't be blaming individual people. Yeah.
Do you eat meat?
Yes.
I genuinely think that New Zealand's going to have to change the way it does everything in terms of what Ange is going.
Well, I just think, isn't it interesting that we hold the kakapo so sacred, that we hold the dolphin so sacred, the tui, and yet we're prepared
Depends how you cook them, really, Ange, doesn't it?
Very good. But we're prepared to put a whole lot of cows in a paddock with no shelter and take their children from them.
Oh, stop it!
It's true. Why is that okay?
I know.
Why is a tui more sacred than a sparrow? Why are we prepared to spray poison around and kill our ecosystems whilst we revere, the kiwi?
Because
or
people
whatever.
are not rational.
It is interesting because what Ange's talking about there is this model that we have in which we have dominion. We have dominion over the ecosystem and dominion over animals and dominion over the land.
No, seriously. I mean, Judeo-Christianity has got an awful lot to answer for.
Okay. And so there's a different narrative there, right? There's a different frame in which we exist, not exerting ourselves over the environment, but living
as part of
it. And there's different ways to frame that. And obviously there are different ways to frame that is more palatable to different groups of people. And there are different models which work where we do work much more in partnership with the environment and the ecosystem that sustains us than in dominion over. And the eating meat thing is part of it. I would say there is a huge amount of work going on about how do you retool our current agricultural system? How do you get more locally based, across the different ministries? There is a huge amount of input going on into how do you decentralise, how do you get local and regional production of agriculture? There are people working really hard about thinking about how we can shift it.
Yeah, but then it just gets complicated, right? There's a seaweed that you can feed to cows and it massively reduces their methane production.
Yeah, and that depends what you value, right? Do you value the existing system, keeping the existing system?
Exactly.
Or do
so people, perfectly environmentally correct people are seizing on the seaweed and saying, yes, we have an answer to the methane production.
So then you have to have the values conversation first, right? You have to have the values conversation first as opposed to the technocratic conversation first.
And the reason why the fundamental values that underpin our society, I think it needs to be looking to a different set of values that have always existed. But, we can't keep inputting different sort of alternatives into the same system and expecting a different outcome. We need to fundamentally change the values that underpin the system and what we see as development, what we see as living, what a living standard for everyone. And I think that's why the systemic is really important, because otherwise, we can feed the cows seaweed, but at the same time, maybe there'll be some issue with seaweed farming that could be really unsustainable.
Or maybe we'll just have too many damn cows because we think it's fine. There's a word for that kind of efficiency paradox or something.
And the other thing I think is like not viewing these issues in isolation. As Ange was saying, the climate crisis is only one manifestation of a completely unsustainable system on a finite planet. And so we need to view and tackle it in tandem with tackling the ecological crisis that we are facing as well. And so the way that we address climate change cannot be just focusing on carbon emissions. We need to think about the impact that obviously agriculture is also having on the land as well. And so it's not just methane, obviously, that's the big issue, but the way that it's affecting the land and the rivers, and not viewing, I think it's, again, slipping into this Western frame of viewing all of these things in isolation rather than as a system.
Can I say a couple of things on farming? The first one I'd like to say is that one of my favourite farmer is actually in the audience today, and he has biked 2.5 hours this morning from the Baton Valley. Most of you will know where the Baton Valley is, up the top of the Motueka Valley, to be here. Thank you, Richard. I'm totally honoured.
He's a sweaty one at the back, is he?
The other thing I want to say, and this is just a sort of an interesting piece of information that you may not know, but it was some research that came out fairly recently, that over the top of pine forests emit a phytochemical called monoterpenes. They're one of the chemicals that's responsible for the smell that you get in pine needles. And what monoterpenes do is that they actually take out or change the chemical makeup of the air that's above them to mean that they can't then break down methane. So what we have in this country is a particularly lethal combination of a whole lot of dairy farming producing a whole lot of methane and a whole lot of pine forests that mean that methane actually can't be broken down. So it's an interesting thing. And I've got a couple of other just interesting sea level bits of random information that I think is quite interesting to think about. I always thought that the sea level was just a level. But actually, it's different all over the place. At the top of the South Island, the sea level is 2 metres higher than at the bottom of the South Island. So we're on a slope. And in Fiordland, the big granite mass, it draws the sea towards it. It's 7 metres higher than it is 35 kilometres out to sea. So, this is this complexity of the world that we live in. And one of the things that changes the temperatures of the ocean is the fish moving around and swirling the water around as they move. So we've the way that we frame this world in this scientific kind of understanding that we have is so limited. And as a medical professional, I know this from having worked with human bodies for so long. It's not like it is in the textbooks. So what we're dealing with here is a whole lot of complexity on different levels, much of which we don't even know yet. And that's why we have to stay very open to what we can imagine for our future, because we, in fact, don't even necessarily have the language to describe what it is that we're going towards.
Now, we could talk forever, I know. But I do want to hear from the audience, and I'm sure you've got questions, preferably rather than statements, unless they're incredibly interesting. And the microphone will come to you.
I'm Bill, and I live in Blenheim. For the past 75 minutes, we've been hearing a lot of words. Could you tell me about the role of listening around climate issues?
Well, you've done very well so far. I think that's a question for Jess.
One of the things that we talk about is that in order for people who are perhaps in polarised positions to become less polarised, is that they need to feel that they're heard. So, for example, we're doing some work at the moment in my organisation in agriculture, and what we're talking about is that when people have very strong or kind of entrenched positions who you actually do need to work with. So I make my joke about the Mike Hoskins of the world, but there are people with entrenched positions in power who you need to engage with. And in order for them to feel that they can move, they first need to be heard. So there's this really important aspect, and I think we've talked about that today, about how much are we listening to what people value and what they're worried about and what their fears are, because at the base of so much of this, and entrenched positions especially, is fear. And with these kind of fears come deep emotions, and we love to pretend that we're somehow neutral, that emotions don't play a part in our decision making. I would say that until we can engage with the fact that emotions are key to the decision-making processes that we make in the world, then it's really hard to move people into a different place.
One of our board members, who's also our kaumātua, he's 80, he's been on our board now for nearly 35 years. Often when we have to make a decision, he'll say, "What does the river think?" And what he means is go outside, and you need to go outside and listen to what the river's saying or what the land is saying before we embark on a particular course. So that's something that really is important to us, is just listening to the environment.
It's a key skill of a good leader.
Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnei te mihi to our panel, to Kim. The question is actually to Kim. You've heard it all before. You've interviewed people on the climate change and things, and you seem to bring it back to the realities of action and practicalities of what do we do. If you were given, if it was a fridge magnet reminder to put, what will be your summary of tips of what to do or action to do on that fridge magnet? Because we receive things from the civil defense of reminders of what to do during emergency. If we were to give out that fridge magnet reminder of what could we do in our household for practical steps, what would we do include in that?
I think it boils down to pay attention. Pay attention. Because I realise that much of my life I've been relatively unconscious. You know, you do your stuff, you go and you go and you go. I find this debate and the time we're living in now really exhilarating. It's been my experience that we haven't been in these kind of times before, where we are analysing ourselves, we're facing an existential crisis, we're examining what it means to be human and to be good. And it's a pain in the ass sometimes, but it's so interesting. And not just in a theoretical way, it matters. And if we pay attention, then it's going to be quite taxing, but it's going to be a hell of a lot more interesting than being unconscious.
I've heard that the Buddhists say that at the moment there are souls lining up to be reincarnated right now because it's such an exciting time to be alive.
Hi. So the gentleman at the beginning here said that you're asked about words and listening. I'm an illustrator, and so I deal with images, and I'm really interested in how images work, especially in the media, to do with climate change. And I see you're nodding there, so I'm hoping you might have something to say about that, because I know there's been a lot of research done, and there are images that work, and there are images that don't, and generally speaking, polar bears don't, which break my heart.
No, the polar bears don't. That's great you asked that question. Actually, somebody sent me a new organisation, which I hadn't heard of the other day, which is specifically producing what they call evidence-based climate imagery. So they've done research into the types of imagery which motivate people. And one of their main things is they talk about having people in them. And then what we also know from the research is that local impacts are really important in terms of imagery. Far-reaching impacts like the polar bears, like the melting ice caps, don't work. The other thing the research says is that because we've been saturated in this negativity and this fear-based framing, that the context, you have to think about that context and then move people into a different context with your imagery as well. So positive vision making, like when we did our research, so we've just produced some guidance on how to talk about climate change particularly, and when we did that research, it was actually really difficult for me to find, so I often look for practical examples of how people are communicating in this space. All I could find was fear-based imagery, just constantly fear-based imagery. So it's just, we're saturated in it, right? And what Kim just said about how excited she was and that kind of emotional response that comes with these are really important, sophisticated conversations that we're having, that needs to be framed in our imagery as well, because that's what brings people into the space of like, wow, we can do this, we are doing it. You know, absolutely we can have these important conversations and change things. So the imagery can really support that as well, I would say.
Yeah. Plus, people aren't reading things anymore, is what we've found. We were sending out loads of information. People just don't read. I blame, tweeting and social media for all of that. But so it's finding ways to communicate.
And I agree. I think art is one of the most important tools that we have right now. So we all have gifts, and please, I encourage you, step up and use it.
Is that another way of saying that we need to bypass the analytical and the intellectual and go straight to the emotional? Because I feel a bit weird about that.
No, because I think people make the mistake that if we just engage with people's emotions, but the thing that we know from the research is that emotions are a response to protecting our values and our beliefs. So when we value something, we will form a set of beliefs that essentially support this thing that matters most to me in life. And then our emotions kick in when we hear a piece of information in order to protect those beliefs and those values. So if you're not engaging with people's values, you're just going straight to their emotions, you've got no idea what values and beliefs you're engaging with people. So emotions are important, but not for their own sake. Emotions are important because they're like a traffic light system for our brains to say, yep, that fits with what I already believe, or that doesn't fit with what I already believe. And that's why we talk about going to values first, because sometimes you're not going to shift people. We talk about switching people between their different beliefs. You're not going to switch people to, say, they might hold quite a climate positive set of beliefs, but if you use emotion like fear, that doesn't switch them into that climate positive set of beliefs and values that they have. So, yeah.
I want to, I actually have two questions. One is this fridge magnet, if any of the other four panelists have a fridge magnet, either a picture or a statement that they would put on. And but my own question is that the panel has 5 people. They're all of one gender. And I notice around Greta...
Yeah, but I'm the spokesman for the white male. Remember? He is represented here amongst us today.
Have the white males been asked this? I don't know. But
they're free to ask.
I notice Greta is also often surrounded mainly by young women. And I just want to know if anyone wants to comment on that, along with a fridge magnet picture or statement.
I could partially answer that question. I did actually try to get some men involved in this panel, and it just didn't happen for a whole lot of reasons, and the mixture was right, and I just went with the flow. So there you go. Over to you.
I don't know. Do you feel that we're lacking, Ange? It's what we call a leading question.
Well, I think that the future is in the feminine, not in the feminine as in women, but I think in realising those values, and so this is quite beautifully representative of that.
Have you got a fridge magnet?
Fridge magnet. Listen to the river. I pinched it off Kerensa, sorry.
Right then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's a bad thing that we've got 4 women on a 5 women on a panel with the representative for the white men as well. But yeah, I think that's awesome. I think there's no qualms with that. I think my fridge magnet would be, what kind of ancestor do you want to be?
Jess.
Yeah, it's interesting to me about the WANL, as I call it, the all-woman panel, as opposed to the MANL. Some of the research that we look at in this space is that, for example, I do a lot of work in transport, and what we know is that one of the problems with people who use car trips for short car trips and frequently is it's a man problem, to be perfectly honest with you, is that women take completely different journeys. So I think understanding the gender dynamics that underplay some of those issues is important. So it is interesting to me that it's, you do see a lot of women engaging in this space. I'm just thinking back in my fridge magnet. I have a lovely picture that my oldest daughter drew of her with my youngest daughter holding her hand saying, "I love you, Florrie." And for me, that's why I do this, my responsibility to that generation, not just my children actually, but to all of the generations to come after us.
Hi. Kerensa.
My fridge magnet, I'm not even going to answer the woman question, is don't give up. So I think there's a lot of hard work. There is a lot of intellectual, analytical work that needs to be done, and good, strong leadership. And that's one area I'm concerned about, the leadership. But mine's just don't give up. It's perseverance. It's not kindness is important. Our Prime Minister in particular talks a lot about kindness, but kindness is not going to get us there in and of itself. It's hard work, determination, perseverance.
So far, we've heard a lot of talk about limiting temperatures and so on, and perhaps the number of cows. But what about people? There are already too many people in the world, aren't there? And are there any conversations or public policy going on about limiting people, setting limits? Some cultures already have feelings for large families. What about young people? Are you thinking about not having children at all? Be interested.
I mean, personally, if it's okay for me to start something I hear among a lot of young people is this fear of having children. So, even some of the 12-year-olds that I have been privileged to work with this year are talking about the fact that they're scared to have children, and they're not sure whether that's something that they will want to do, not because they don't want to be parents, but because they're scared about the future that they're going to be passing on to them, and kind of potentially the injustice of bringing them into a world that can't sustain them. So I think that's really sad and horrible that our young people are thinking about this. Personally, I think, again, my answer to the question of population as a solution to tackling climate change comes back again to the way that we think of what the issue is determines the solutions that we come up with. So if we think, okay, everyone needs to live this standard of life, this particular way of life with these values, these systems, that we are engaged with currently, then of course we can't sustain the people on this planet. But there are many countries with much larger families who have way lower carbon footprint. And so actually it's not the people, it's the systems again. And so I think that it's really, it could be a very, not damaging, but I think that sort of criminalising, these usually like lower income families that have, large families being like, you guys are the issue because you're having all these children. They're not the issue. The systems are the issue.
And let's face it, there's a gender inequity in there, right? Like that is about women having children. And, I think coming about that from a different perspective, one of the best things that we can do is empower women in the climate change movement. And the way that you can empower women mostly is access to birth control. That's one of the best things that you can do in terms of women having choice about whether they have children or not. And there are still millions of women in this world who don't have a choice. So I'm less interested in people saying you can't have children and much more interested in saying, do you want to have children and how can we help you make that choice? And then what alternatives are there if you're not having children, about empowering you to be the decision makers and the power holders in your country.
Yeah. Yes.
And to a certain extent, when anyone says, the problem is the world's population, isn't it like you're in a car in a traffic jam complaining about too many drivers? I mean, sorry.
You are traffic. Kia ora, thank you. Fascinating we're having this conversation. I think we're coming to the reality at last that environmental degradation has never been on the other side of the balance sheet on our ledgers. Just coming to terms with the results of that now, really. How do you feel about, and also that the earth is there for our resources, how do you feel about a change for our well-being and a change from our GDP, gross domestic product, to something like a genuine progress indicator, whereas all work, all voluntary work is included and honoured? Who's bringing up the children? Who's doing the Meals on Wheels? Who's doing the caring work? So that we have a more equality throughout the system, yeah. Who's cleaning the toilet?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that too is about visibility across what we value and what we're going to say we value as a nation, right? And I think to give some credit to our government, we've done some really innovative things here in that respect. So we've given, we're the first country in the world to give a river, the Whanganui River, its own legal personality. We're looking at ways now in terms of the settlement for Mount Taranaki to do the same. So how do you give a natural asset legal personhood and then have that thing represented when decisions are being made? That's really incredible and speaks to our values. And in the same way, the value of our voluntary work and what we do is another issue that definitely needs to be addressed through the work that Treasury is doing, for example, and it's not, as far as I can see. But it goes back to our values and what we recognise as good.
Yeah. And it does interest me that in that work by Treasury, there's a lot of talk about voluntary work, which they see quite separately from unpaid labour, which is kind of like over here.
Yeah. I mean, the system that we have currently is only possible because of unpaid labour, I think. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that if we begin valuing that work and structuring a system more around measuring, those other things that we value that are actually way more intrinsic to humanity than money.
Can we not value it without counting it?
Yes, of course.
I mean, I understand the counting for nothing argument, and I'm all with Marilyn Waring on that, But if we're just going to drag it into the accountant's office...
Yeah, but she doesn't think that anymore,
No.
She's moved on from that.
All right.
Her position on that is that it's about recognition and redistribution. Because if you place it within the existing system of financial value... Yeah. I mean, counting it is important. Don't count it, you don't see it. And data is important. And, we haven't had a conversation about data and how important data collection is. But I would also argue that we collect data on what we value, right? So unless we value a thing, we don't.
No, that's quite right. It's a dilemma. I cut you off. Sorry. What were you going to say?
Well, I just think this is, again, it's an exciting part of relocalisation and, looking at how can we form a local economy where there's more time banking or, that we actually start to step away from the economic model that we've had and create something new. And these are just things that we have, the economy, money, how we've formed our society are just human constructs, and we have this wonderful opportunity to do things differently now.
There's a hand up right at the back.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. I'm Kate Fulton, Nelson City Councillor, and I have a question for Raven. Raven, during the last council election, a lot of young people still didn't vote, and I'd expected to see, a lot of young people did vote, but I'd expected to see a greater turnout considering the student strikes and Extinction Rebellion. And if I look around the room this morning, I think you're probably the youngest here and not... A few younger people.
There's a young lady putting her hand up.
Whereas I'm quite sure the turnout at the rugby last night was quite different. How do we take our young people with us in this journey in everything and increase the voter turnout in particular. But and I'll give you an example. My daughter's at Otago this year, and she put up notes on her notice boards in her shared house. None of her flatmates voted, and she was so disappointed. So there's some really engaged young people, and then there's some young people who are well educated, well connected in their communities, have good upbringings, and then they seem to go to university and they sort of switch off into their own worlds. How do we change that?
Good question.
I mean, I think that my first thing would be to say that I think young people have a real distrust of the system, and especially one that has never really represented our interest. And I was in a very privileged position this year of being able to vote for 3 of my really good friends who decided to put their hat in the ring for the Greater Wellington Regional Council and the Wellington City Council. So for the first time, I actually saw someone who looked like me, represented my values, cared about the things that I cared about, and who I knew on a personal level, who had come and engaged with the university students, actually made the effort to come and talk to us and listen to what we cared about, to vote for. But that is the first time that I've ever had the opportunity to vote for someone like that before. So I think, a lot of young people, for them, it's just a case of flicking through the leaflet that is distributed and just seeing, no one really that represents their values, and young people still are not really seen as an important group to have at the table in terms of actually engaging with us in a non-tokenistic way that, really... I guess I did some sort of surveying because Sophie and I had the chance to speak at the local government conference earlier this year, and we had the same question, why are young people not engaging with us? Why are they not getting involved with council meetings and stuff? And we put some questions out on Instagram, and we had so many young people feeding back, and they were saying, well, council meetings are during school hours, so how are we ever meant to go along, represent our values in the same way that someone, who is retired or has the ability to go to those meetings can? B, they never come to us. We're expected to go into their spaces, which for a lot of young people is really a scary space to go into because, when I spoke at that council, local government council conference, I was definitely the youngest person in the room, and I was really terrified of looking out at this crowd of people that I didn't know if they would be taking me seriously. So a lot of the feedback that we had was entering young people's spaces on their terms in a space where they feel comfortable. And I don't think that this is just for young people, but for all people who are traditionally underrepresented in decision making. Those systems are not systems that they feel represented in or safe in engaging with. And for a lot of people, they feel like, I can vote for this person or this person, but the outcome will be the same. So
there's some very, I mean, there's some really interesting research around disengagement in political activism, or actually even voting, which is when you think that everybody's values are just about individualism and consumerism and what's in it for me, people disengage from political activity. When they see the types of values, like collective values, that most people do hold dear but are kind of suppressed, then you get a lot more political engagement, more voting behaviour, more engagement in collective activism. So there's this kind of structural system around what we value and what we talk about, what we say we value and what we actually value, which feeds into political engagement as well.
If anyone else has something to say, otherwise I've got some more stuff to say about this topic. I just think that as well, in terms of viewing the school strikes and then viewing engagement in local government, one of those is about challenging an existing system, operating outside of a framework, and one of them is very much just operating within a framework that we've been handed. So I think, it makes sense why one of them, a lot more people feel able to get involved with, really trust that they're going to be heard because it's on their terms and it's in a framework that we're creating together, whereas one of them is just that one that we've been handed. But also, obviously, the voting age. I don't know exactly now the proportion of age in Nelson, but obviously a lot of young people that can vote leave Nelson to go to university, and then the people that are at school, many of them don't have the right to vote. So attending things like school strikes is literally the reason why that movement was created was because the democratic systems that we have do not have an avenue for young people to tangibly have their voice heard. And that needs to change.
We've got time for one more question, if you've got one. All right.
Kia ora, and thank you for all your input. I'm interested in the value of, like the UN is one of the only international organisations, and it's obviously a bit broken. And I'm wondering about the possibility or the visioning, if you like, of a mass movement that incorporates countries. So it's looking beyond individual countries. It's some other super version of the UN that actually has the care of the environment at its absolute heart, and where there's all levels of commitment, right from individual to community to countries to, things on this really big scale. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's a possibility that as a species that we could create this sort of super mass movement that combines these kind of values where we all feel that we can sort of do something at that level? So that's my idea. And I'm putting that forward. I'm interested in your response.
I think those movements already exist, actually. I mean, there's a lot of connected up international organisations. For example, Action Station in New Zealand's connected with Get Up in Australia, which is connected with, I can't remember what the other organisation in America, and there's one in the UK. Same with the Green New Deal. That came out of a collaboration between the New Economics Foundation in the UK and then a campaigning organisation in the US. So I think they exist. I think looking for them within a kind of formal bureaucratic structure probably isn't the answer. I think it's making more of those connections internationally and globally between those organisations that exist would be. But Raven, you'll have a view on it from your campaigning.
I think that we're in a very interesting time where I feel like the solutions that need to be driven, they have to happen very much on a local level, but we have to think and have the framework on the global level, because obviously we are in this era where the issues like what we do here affects people on the other side of the world, and it's very complicated. But I do think, and I think there are these movements like School Strike for Climate is operating across the world, and like pretty much most countries, young people are being inspired by what other young people are doing. And like in New Zealand, we decided to start it in Aotearoa because we were so inspired by what was happening in Australia and Europe. And we're very much, with social media, able to communicate constantly with organisers in other countries. So there is kind of this web of young people who are able to organise together. But I think that there is also kind of a risk in terms of taking something that was created in another country and then just imposing that on a local situation. So that for School Strike for Climate has been a really big process that we're in the midst of at the moment, is figuring out, how does this movement actually, how can it be appropriate in Aotearoa in this colonial context, and how can we make sure that these values and the kind of methods that we've inherited from overseas, how can we make sure that they're actually fit for purpose here for the young people of Aotearoa and the solutions that we need here locally? So that's why I think it's really important not to just take values and then put them somewhere, because they're never going to be appropriate. It needs to be born from this place and for the people here and the historical context here. So we're very much currently in the process of learning and listening and figuring out how that looks. And I think that's fundamental.
And I guess I would say, absolutely, we've tried that. It hasn't worked on that big institutional, constitutional level, and that's what my film 2 Degrees looked at. But absolutely, across the world right now, there are millions of groups, millions of tiny lights that are joining together to make a big movement. And it's like I think of us as the immune system of the earth. It's like where the white blood cells are actually really activating. And I'll just agree what Raven just said about that being being wary of transplanting stuff from other places. And it might be of interest to you to know that Extinction Rebellion, when Extinction Rebellion brought the principles of that organisation, which it really isn't. They try not to call themselves an organisation, but they got the values from the UK. And then one of the members in Wellington took those principles to some kaumātua, and the kaumātua read them and interpreted them through their own Te Ao Māori model, something that was appropriate for Aotearoa, and translated them into Te Reo Māori. And then they were translated back into English with that lens of te tiriti. And so basically the principles that we have here in Aotearoa for Extinction Rebellion are different than those ones that came from the UK. And I just thought that was a really beautiful process that that organisation went through.
I would add, I think there's a lot of Indigenous groups which don't get the recognition and amplification, which are existing in networks that present at the UN. We've got our own young people's Indigenous group around climate change. And I think there's a huge amount of work that we can do to amplify those existing groups who've been working for a much longer than the existing groups which are just coming today as well.
Yeah. 100%, yeah. Yes, definitely want to add to that there are obviously, groups like the Pacific Climate Warriors and Te Arawhatu, which is an Indigenous group of rangatahi from Aotearoa that go to the UN climate talks every year, and they've been working in this space for ages, and now and there's definitely like a sense of frustration about the fact that school strike, we've existed for 10 months and it's just catapulted into mainstream recognition. And so I think in order to actually be fit for purpose in Aotearoa, those are the voices that need to be amplified, and 100% it's about we need to really create space and amplify.
How can you sponsor them? How can these lovely people sponsor them?
Yeah, so if you, and I think it is, if you have supported the School Strike for Climate kaupapa and been to the strikes, it's 100% important if you have the means to be able to support groups like that and attending the UN. You can find them on Facebook, Te Arawhatu, and they're currently fundraising to be able to attend the climate negotiations in Chile in December, and will be an invaluable voice for Aotearoa at those talks.
Thank you. And thank you all. It's been a privilege to be here. I'm very glad that these 4 people exist. And I'm very glad you all exist as well. Please thank the panel.
And of course, we all want to thank you, Kim. Thank you very much for chairing such a fantastic conversation. Totally deserved going over time, didn't it? Yeah. And another big thank you to Page and Blackmore for making this, being our principal sponsor and making this happen. And I just want to say, Jess, your book, I read it when I was first programming this year's program, and it really influenced me and made this session happen. So please come and buy a copy of Jess's book. It's a fantastic little handbook, and get her to sign it, if you don't mind. Yes?
Yes, that would be wonderful. Mainly for BWB's purposes.
I just want a quick show of hands. How many of you believe that giving children sugary things makes them hyperactive? Hands up. You deal with that, don't you? Interesting, eh?
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your day. You're listening to the 2018 Nelson Arts Festival, Page and Blackmore Pukapuka Talks.